Good afternoon, welcome to session 6. And we are one less person than is planned, which means that we have a little bit of flexible time for questions and answers. So in order to make this a place where we have conversation, I will then immediately start to give the floor to Miriam Cooke so that we have enough time at the end for question and answer. Miriam, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you see if I sit, or would it be better if I stood? Maybe standing.
We'll have 20 minutes for each.
Hey, I thought we had a little more.
Question and answer, yes.
Okay.
Good afternoon. It is a pleasure to be here, and I want, of course, to first of all thank Jamal Noor Hojam for involving me in this conference and in a world that she's really introduced me to. And I also want to thank pretty much everybody who has spoken so far, because you've helped me really think through some of the issues that have been preoccupying me for a while. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk more, I think, about what I thought the subject of the conference was, and that is rethinking methodologies. So I know a lot of you have been saying that, well, you know, we don't really have to define, and we don't have to make a distinction necessarily between Sufism and Islam. And what I'm going to try and do today is to think about the ways in which women, Muslim women, Sufi women, are taught. And I'm going to be talking obviously about America, the United States, because that's where I have been teaching. Also a bit in Europe. I was educated in England. So my words will be pretty much directed toward a Euro-American audience of students, but I'm hoping that maybe we can start to think about ways in which we can cross-fertilize our pedagogical approaches, so that the way in which you study Islam, Sufism, and to the extent to which women are taught here, and I would love to have a bit of a discussion about that, why it is, it seems to me, even though Bill Chittick reprimanded me when I told him a little while ago that I thought that most of the conference had been about men, and I was thinking it was time. Thank you to Juliana, who said, well, you know, I always have to put gender into it, and I always have gender everywhere, so this will be about gender everywhere. So, which in some ways almost is like a proposal for maybe 1 to 5 kinds of courses that would deal with Muslim women, Sufi women. I'm going to be posing a lot of questions. Now, these aren't questions that I'm planning to answer. And in fact, for me, the most interesting questions are ones to which I don't have an answer, and that I hope with time, maybe some answer will come either from me or from wonderful people like Jamal Noor Hojam, who allows me to think very deeply about things that I have thought about superficially before. But the questions that I'm going to be posing are the kinds of questions that I think we need to have our students think about. And so I will interject regularly those kinds of questions. So, to start, some of the questions that I would want my students in a number of different classes to ask is, for example, is a Muslim saint a Sufi? Do Sufis necessarily belong to institutions? Are there women Muslim saints? And then the question I'm going to be asking throughout is the Muslim saint as opposed to the Sufi saint. If Sufism is twinned with tariqat in the way that I have heard it so much today, in other words, with institutions, and because women don't belong to tariqat generally, except of course here, are women therefore excluded from being Sufi saints? Do we then possibly think about the fact that if and I'm going to be talking about 3 Arab women today who are called saints, are they perhaps Owaisi, not having had a murshid or a peer? So where do they come from? Although few women have been highlighted in the stories of Muslim saints, many have played important roles in spiritual and educational affairs from the early days of Islam. And this morning before coming here, Bruce and I went to St. Agnes Church, which was, it was a cathedral. And St. Agnes, I brought the brochure. It's not a brochure, I mean, it was a program for this morning. And so here in the 4th century, a young girl who called for death. She was in a hurry to die because she wanted to join her husband-to-be, which was Jesus Christ. And I think, Jamal Noor, you have also spoken about such Muslim women saints, women, almost girl saints. So a famous hadith cites the Prophet Muhammad enjoining his followers to take 2/3 of their religion from al-Humayra, Aisha. So if they are to take it from her, why not take religious and spiritual instruction from women? How should Muslim women saints be integrated into classes on religion and women's studies classes? And that, of course, is a very, I guess, Euro-American issue to have women's studies classes. In this talk today, I will focus on the feminist aspect of the lives of 3 Muslim Arab women considered to be saints. I will look at the narratives told about and by them that provide examples of empowerment through some form of ethical and spiritual practice. You may remember yesterday Carla used that as a definition for Sufism. And I'm going to particularly look at jihad. So obviously jihad al-asghar, but also in some ways twisted a bit to the jihad al-akbar. The hagiographies of the Basra saint Rabi' al-Adawi al-Qaysiyya, 717 to 801, the Tunisian Lala Aisha Manoubiya, 1180 to 1267, and the Egyptian Zainab al-Ghazali, 1917 to 2005. Their hagiographies confirm the consequential impact of their lives and the narratives they have inspired. Each sought to bring those with whom she came into contact closer to God. So, is a Muslim woman who is considered a saint necessarily Sufi? Can Muslim women be considered Sufi when they do not belong to a tariqah? So again, a repetition of those questions. These are the kinds of questions students need to have in mind throughout the course, whether it is under the rubric of a religious studies course or women's studies. The first serious enumeration of the lives of Sufi women saints is Abu Abd al-Rahman al-Sulami, who died in 1106. His 11th century, Dhikr al-Niswa al-Muta'abidat al-Sufiyat, mention of pious Sufi women. He begins with Rabi'a, providing a few extant citations with chains of authority going back 3 centuries that define Rabi'a, the saint and specialist, in the study of legal doctrines pertaining to worship. Out of these few words attributed to Rabi'a, has emerged a legend. So, question for the students. Should students consider throughout the course how the legend of the 8th century Rabia al-Adawiyya has shaped the frame narratives of other Muslim women's hagiographies? One of the most challenging questions, I believe, would be, are the similarities between the Rabia legend, the myths surrounding the 13th century Lala Aisha Manubiyya, and the prison memoir of the 20th century Zainab al-Ghazali, indicative of a pattern in Muslim women's sainthood? Or is there a trunk narrative which new details from the life of a later saint embellish an earlier version? Generations of followers absorb new details, elaborate them from miracles they have witnessed, and in the process, they may produce two new versions, one returning to a deep past, and the other pointing forward to healing expected from a future pilgrimage. Of course, healing both spiritual and physical. So the prime case for the study of a distant saint's life and influence is the legend of Rabia. In her dissertation, Rakia Cornell claims that the only historical evidence for Rabia having been more than a myth is a few 9th century mentions of her name by writers, including Jahiz, who had praised her for her rhetoric. Rakia Cornell argues that Rabia was, and I quote from her dissertation, not the founder, but the last major figure of a tradition of women's asceticism in Basra that went back more than a century before her. So she, according to this version, obviously is not the first. The origins of this tradition can be traced to the Prophet Muhammad's widow, Aisha al-Humayra, who lived in Basra and practiced asceticism at the end of her life. The first major figures of this tradition was Mu'adh al-Adawiyya, who died in 702, and she was a member of Rabia's clan, who was a servant of Aisha. Textual evidence, Rakia Cornell continues, indicates that Mu'adh al-Adawiyya formulated the theology of servitude, ta'abbud, that Sulami saw as representative of Rabia's spirituality, end of quote. In other words, Cornell is questioning even the very few citations that Sulami included in Dhikr Nisa al-Muta'abidat. Additionally, she places Rabia in a whole community of pious women, and this is so crucial, especially in a women's studies course, that not to exceptionalize one woman. This is what happened during the war, the Battle of Algiers. I mean, during the War of Independence, there were a few heroines that emerged, but when they were referred to as heroines, the reaction was, I'm not a heroine. I did exactly what the women with whom I was, they did the same as me. They are more heroic than I am. And this, I think, is really crucial to understand, that Rabia was within a community of pious muta'abidat women. Yet, despite the fact that there are so few citations in Sulami, and Rakia Cornell claims that they probably are not even from her, there are today so many stories about Rabia. There are probably later elaborations, many by Fariduddin Attar in his Tazkirat al-Awliya, Memorial of the Saints. These stories have moved from the oral to the written in a text that was compiled by one of the masters of Sufi adab. And I'm interested in this move from written to oral to written, and that which was written and remains written. I hope that will become clear. So these stories include the miraculous circumstances surrounding her birth. I'm sure many of you are familiar with them. Rabia's parents died when she was young, and during a famine that hit Basra, she was captured, sold into slavery for 6 dinars. Although her owner worked her hard, she fasted continuously and immersed herself in prayer. One night, her owner saw a blinding light above her, heard her supplications to God that she might be liberated from her menial servitude in order to devote herself wholly to his service. In the morning, he manumitted her. She then left for the desert, and after a short stay in a zawiya, made for Mecca to perform the Hajj. Placing her goods on a donkey, she began a journey so arduous, that it killed the donkey. Distraught, she entreated God's help so that she might complete her spiritual duty. The donkey was restored to life. One story tells of her pursuit of the pilgrimage and of the Kaaba coming to greet her. When the zealously pious Ibrahim ibn Adham arrived in Mecca and didn't see the Kaaba, he was consumed with jealousy to see the two of them approach him. She said to have met with Hassan al-Basri. She would have been 3 years old, if that had been true, who challenged her to a duel of miracles. And again, I'm sure I'm telling stories that most of you know, but for those who don't. Throwing his prayer carpet on the waters, he taunted her to try and pray 2 ruqas. Her answer was to throw her own prayer rug into the air, fly up onto it, and cry out, and I quote, clearly not from Rabia, but from somebody, what you did, fishes also do. What I did, flies also do. The real business is outside such tricks. So we're talking about the importance of stories. Jamal Noor Hojam is the master mistress of stories. So yeah, great stories, but who knows? She never married, despite the expectation that women should marry and bear children. This is an important issue also in connection with the ways in which Muslim women are expected to act, but also in the way that Muslim women, saints, are supposed to act. So neither married nor bore children. When the ascetic Sufyan Thawri once urged her to pray to be cured of a serious illness, she replied that God had willed her suffering. Again, I think of the stories that you talk about disease coming as a guest that we need to welcome, even if only for a short time. How could Sufyan bid her to request God something contrary to his will? She told him that even love for Muhammad could not approach her exclusive love for God, the highest level of internal adab, or al-hubb lillahi. Fariduddin Attar's extravagant assessment of Rabia comes to in his comparison of her to men, her superiority to men, which indicates how mythical her life had become by the 13th century. And I quote a short poem. No, she wasn't a single woman, but 100 men over, robed in the quintessence of pain from foot to face, immersed in the truth, effaced in the radiance of God, and liberated from all superfluous excess. Leila Ahmed in Women, Gender, and Islam writes that the narratives about Rabia's surpassing her male colleagues exemplify, and I quote, countercultural elements with respect to ideas about gender. And Attar obviously has turned her into a feminist exemplar. What some people say is that actually he's turning her into a man, and that's part also of what is said about a lot of Muslim women saints, that they masculinize to the point of even, you know, growing a beard. I don't know how they do that, but I think it is absolutely clear that what he's saying is that she is superior to 100 men. So do these feminist assessments undermine her status as a Sufi saint? This is a crucial issue with which students should wrestle throughout the course. Sulami's quotations of Rabia's words are few, but the stories are many. It's as though we know this woman, and the narratives surrounding her extraordinary life have shaped the frame narratives of other Sufi women's hagiography, including Manaqib, the hagiography of Lala Aisha Manubiya, written down by the Imam of the Manuba Mosque. Like Rabia, her birth was miraculous. When her mother was 7 months pregnant, the great Baghdadi saint Sidi Abdul Qadir al-Jilani happened to visit Manuba. Upon meeting the pregnant woman, mother, he passed his hand over her stomach and told her she was going to give birth to a saint. In so doing, he had created a physical, spiritual chain between the infant and his 12th century Sufi Qadiriya order. From inside her womb, Aisha's terrified mother, here's another one of those stories. From inside her womb, Aisha's terrified mother heard her daughter, also known as Habibatullah, reassuring her it's okay. Like Rabia, Aisha's travel to Mecca was miraculous, but in her case it took place outside of time in a night journey. And until today, devotees who lose consciousness during the Sunday ritual will often repeat the miraculous pilgrimage story, but as though describing their own experience. Like Rabia, Lala Aisha is said to have been beautiful and to have received many marriage proposals, but she too never married and therefore obviously didn't have children. Like Rabia, she abided by Islamic norms, yet the most central for women, marriage and children, she eschewed. To study with her mentor, the great saint of Morocco, Abul Hassan al-Shadili, Rabia left her father's home in Manuba to go to her khalwa in Tunis. Acquaintances were scandalized, unable to imagine a beautiful woman living alone without sin. Yet the move was a necessary part of her jihad that called for a cut from her family to strengthen the spiritual affiliation to Ashadili. Like Rabia, she resuscitated a dead animal. In her case, it was a bull. This miracle, told in detail in Manaqib and repeated by the Manuba shrine Wakila, established her sainthood. The story is repeated at the beginning of each ritual, this Sunday ritual I was talking about, for women at the Manuba and Tunis shrines. So she has two shrines. They're very close to each other, but the Manuba one is where her father was, and the Tunis one is where she went to be with Shadili. Katia Boissouvin considers this miracle recorded in Manaqib to be central to Lala Aisha's sainthood because it passed from the written to the oral and is constantly repeated at the women's ritual gatherings. Like Rabia again, Aisha is rated superior to contemporary male saints. Like Rabia, and unlike most descriptions of female Muslim saints, she did not masculinize, nor did she follow rules and norms of femininity. She's become for many a model of timeless femininity. In this final section, I'll address the miraculous life or the miraculous period in the life of a 20th century woman whose hagiography did not move from the oral to the written, like Rabia's, or from the written to the oral, like Aisha's, but remains until now in written form because it's quite recent. At the request of some acolytes, and she's very clear about that, I didn't want to write this memoir of my miraculous life, but my acolytes asked me to do it. So at the request of some acolytes, Zainab al-Ghazali, president of the Muslim Ladies Association, tells the story of her days, ayam, so it's ayam and hayati, days from my life, of her days resisting Nasr. Ayam in Arabic also meaning battles. I've argued elsewhere that her prison memoirs, entitled Ayam and Hayati, 1976, is her scripting of her own hagiography. Despite the different context in which this text is written, the narrative often follows the pattern of Rabia's legend. In her version of the 5 years in the infamous Torab prison, she is more powerful, more rightly guided than the pious men with whom she was arrested for a suspected plot against President Nasser in the 60s. Like Fariduddin Attar's extolling of Rabia's superiority to 100 men, Zainab vaunts her spiritual and physical ascendancy over the religious authorities, including al-Hudaybi, the leader of the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, who were in prison with her and who had succumbed to torture, she tells us in very, very contemptuous terms. Like Rabia and Aisha, she's a teacher and an ascetic who performs miracles that provide proof of her love for God above all else. The miracles she narrates concern her saintly body. Each one of her torture sessions in the khalwa of her prison becomes a journey into a circle of hell. In one torture chamber, she is surrounded by attack dogs and they can't move. Like Rabia and Aisha, she has a special relationship with animals, but in her case, it's not a matter of raising a corpse from the dead, but rather of reducing the living animal to the equivalent of a corpse. In total, she travels down through 7 circles of hell, to emerge each time more purified and purifying. Some of the gods, whom she refers to as Zabania, watch her miraculous survival, and they're converted from worship of Nasa to worship of God. Reversing the 7 stages of the Mi'raj, she completes the Sufi passage from self to self in her jihad against the corruption of Nasa's Egypt. She is a mujahida, and her heroines are early mujahidat, including Layla bin Tarif and Nusayba bin Ka'b al-Mazniya. Like Rabia and Aisha, unlike Rabia and Aisha, she did marry, but not quite. It was almost as though she had not married. After divorcing her first husband because he interfered in her relationship with God, she was more careful the next time. She wrote into her marriage contract that should her husband interfere in her service to God, she would divorce him. It is here that we can locate the radical move. If, in exceptional times, the call for jihad al-asghar or jihad al-akbar, women may relate to their husbands and children, as men have always related to their wives and children, and yet the moral order is not undone. So then it is permissible for this state of affairs to continue. The good Muslimah must be prepared to be a mujahida, a necessary identity element for the saint, even if not necessarily for the Sufi saint. Or is a Muslim saint necessarily a Sufi saint? So in conclusion, each of these women was a mujahida. Mujahidat improvised rules of conduct, of adab, to speed the establishment of Islam on earth and connection to God. They may not marry, and if they do, it may be symbolic. The 3 women that I have talked about today all spent time working with men in order to bring them closer to God. This jihad is more important than any other activity, and during the fight for a Muslim utopia, it exempts Muslim women from their highest calling of marriage and motherhood. Jihad gives them exceptional rights to negotiate a patriarchal system. Each of these women was empowered to choose the life she wanted, and in so doing provided a model for her followers. Rabia, Aisha, and Zainab al-Ghazali all participated in a jihad that has earned them a place in history. This is true of other Muslim women at the beginning of Islam. So can we begin to think of other empowered women as Sufi saints? What of al-Humayra, Aisha, or Muhammad's daughter, Fatima, and her daughter, Zainab, even though they lived long before Sufism is said to have appeared? So, a few more questions for these hypothetical students. How can we separate Sufi women saints from Muslim women saints, from Islamic activists, when their mystical experiences seem similar? Were Rabia and Aisha not Islamic activists in their day? Could it be that Zainab will someday be accounted as saint? Thank you.
Thank you. Now we turn to Mr. YAMANE on dual trends of Sufi poetry in South Asia. For 20 minutes.
20 minutes. Merhaba, günaydın, iyi akşamlar, tamam. All that vocabulary which I know. When last year I visited Ankara, at that time I just learned. I'm majoring Urdu literature in South Asia. So that's why that I'd like to talk about the Sufi poetry, but actually the Sufi poetry Qawwali, because that there is a very long history and rich production of Urdu poetry, and which is most of them are related to Sufism. So it's quite difficult to talk about that the Sufism in Urdu poetry. So I'd like to focus only on Qawwali songs. And I think that you may know about Qawwali, but before starting my presentation, since 20 minutes, but we have some more. That I would like to show for 5 minutes of the performance of Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan. I knew him very well since that he was invited by Japan Foundation in 1980s. At that time, I was a translator, and I worked as a translator. And at the time, by chance, the Mehrabi were also there. And I remember well that the Mehrabis arrived at the restaurant for dinner slightly late. And at that time, all the food were eaten by the Qawwali parties. So we were at a loss at how to manage it. Anyhow, but I would like to show that how the performance of the Qawwali is. Let's see. Usually that the Qawwali is performed at the tombs of Sufi saints, or every Thursday night, or at the Urs, the death anniversary of Sufi. But since that Nusrat became more popular, and many Qawwali singers began to reside outside the country. This is also a video of in Britain, which was at the inauguration ceremony of one bank there. Okay, so we start. Qawwali performance starts with an instrumental prelude of harmonium. And it takes 3 or 5 minutes. And they are making an imagination that what kind of raga will be performed in one Qawwali. Usually, that the Qawwali parties consist of 8 or 9 persons. This is the main singer, Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan. This is called alap. It is an opening section of a typical North Indian classical performance of a form of melodic improvisation that introduces and develops a raga to be played at the performance. Then the main singer starts to sing some preamble verses that are not part of the main song, but thematically related to it. Then the main song begins. The tabla, the pair of small different sized hand drums and clapping begin. Sometimes the main singer puts some phrases as an improvisation or even sargam of singing the notes instead of the words of composition. This is a This is a sargam of singing the notes instead of the words. That this is a notes of saregama padani of Indic notes. Instead of my presentation, I would like to listen to this for all day. Anyhow, I would like to start my presentation. Thank you very much. So, my presentation aims to study the prosodical characteristics of Qawwali songs, a form of devotional popular music by Sufis, which have gradually developed and changed with the expansion of Islamic culture, mainly in the northern part of South Asia. This is a picture of the recent Pakistani TV program. This is a commercial film, but even in commercial films, such kind of Qawwalis are used. So Islam was introduced to South Asia in the early 8th century through the seaborne trade when some Arabs and Persians began to settle in the western areas of the Indus River Valley. After the 11th century, when Muslim conquerors came to South Asia from Central Asia and established independent kingdoms, the vernacular culture began to be influenced by that of their new rulers. By this, we can see some example of Indo-Islamic cultural syncretism. One of the examples of Indo-Islamic culture is language and its poetry. The language of Urdu evolved from the medieval 6th or 13th century upper branch under the influence of the Persian, Turkish, and Arabic languages. These languages have contributed a significant amount of vocabulary to formal speech and its literature. Poets living under Muslim rule in South Asia incorporated numerous vernacular words into their Persian poetry, which did not fit the rules of Persian prosody, so poets had to adjust them in accordance with Persian prosodic patterns. Through the adaptation of vernacular words to Persian prosodic rhythms, Persian poetry became localized in South Asia and began to be called cooke Hindi, a process which was followed by the creation of new meters. Thus, prosody in Islamic South Asia followed the dual trends, one of the strict Persian prosody, the other a flexible one, combining features of both Persian and vernacular prosodies. The latter phenomenon can be regarded as one of the typical examples of Indo-Islamic culture of fruitful interactions. Another outstanding example of Indo-Islamic culture is Sufism. It is originated in the Middle East in the 9th century and was introduced to South Asia in the 11th century. Many studies argue that Sufism was one of the most important means for peaceful conversion to Islam in South Asia. In the tazkiras, or biographies of the Sufi saints, their miracles or recitations of poetry influenced the local people so much that many converted to Islam. An example of such Sufi poetry is Qawwali, which has remained popular to the present day. Alongside metaphysical Sufism discussed at the court or schools or madrasas by Sufis and scholars, there was a popular version exemplified by Qawwali, which was practiced mostly by common people, common people with no background in metaphysics or philosophy. The former one, which can be called the descriptive, as Dr. Tonaga explained yesterday, or maybe Islam or intellectuals, developed in and around the royal court or madrasas and was heavily influenced by Persian models. For example, Khaja Mir Dard, the famous Sufi poet in Urdu literature in Delhi of the 18th century, wrote not only poetry in Urdu, but also philosophical works on Sufism in Persian. On the other hand, outside of the court culture, we can see some reflection of vernacular influences. We may call it prescriptive or Islam of common people. For instance, many Sufis in Punjab were said to be illiterate, but recited excellent poetry regarding Sufism in the style of Kafi, a kind of Punjabi poetry. By studying prosodic characteristics of Urdu and Punjabi Qawwali songs, we would like to shed some light on the development of Indo-Islamic culture. Qawwali is a form of a Sufi devotional music in South Asia. It is said that it was Amir Khusro of Delhi of 13th or 14th century, a famous Sufi of Chishti order, who started Qawwali in a Sufi or musician or poet, Qawwali in a vernacular language at the Sufi tomb of Muinuddin Chishti of Ajmer. It is also said that he began to write Qawwali songs after when he was impressed with the Qawwali songs in Arabic language at the tomb of Bahauddin Zakaria of Multan. Bahauddin Zakaria belonged to Suflawardi. So as a morning session, Dr. Ninomiya explained that there was a competition between the Chishti and Suflawardiya, but maybe that the competition means that there was a kind of interaction between them. And for missionary work, composing poetry only in Arabic or Persian would have been of limited use in South Asia, since common people do not understand them. So, Sufis began to use vernacular vocabulary in their texts. The Qawwalis, or Qawwali singers, can choose any song or poetry, mostly couplets at random for the audience's enjoyment and devotion. They can also include different phrases from different poems in one song. Its language is generally vernacular and often employs literary tropes drawn from popular Indic devotionalism, bhakti. And the Qawwali is based on raga, as you saw that Nusrat was singing in, only in that the raga style. This is a very important point of the Qawwali. That as you saw that the performance by Qawwals, the Qawwali performance starts with the instrumental prelude of harmonium, then a rap starts, then the main singer begins to start sing songs, some premiable verses that are not part of the main song, but thematically related to it. So these couplets that prosodically different, but in Qawwali songs, it is okay. People never say that this is a different prosodical system or rhythm or something like that. But in ghazals, they are very strict. And Urdu or Persian ghazals are bound on the strict prosodic forms. But Qawwali is very exceptional. And a group of Qawwali musicians usually consists of 8 or 9 men, as you saw. And women are excluded from Qawwals. But nowadays, there are some famous female singers who sing Qawwali songs, but they are called singers, not Qawwals. Qawwali singers are not regarded as Sufi, but they do behave like Sufis, as they show no material desires, or maybe that like yogi. That yesterday, Dr. Karl Ernst described yesterday, that, or according to the European travelogue, they are the ones who are separate or retired from the world. In Urdu, if we say that he is a Sufi or she is a Sufi, means that he or she has no material desires. It seems that Qawwali singers are not regarded as Sufis, but they might be mediators between Sufis and ordinary common Muslims. Their songs bring out the intoxication among the audience. We may distinguish between two kinds of prosody in the Mughal period, that is to say, the Persian strict prosody and the matras of syllables of Indian poetry. Persian poetry is based on the Arabic prosodic system and was localized in South Asia with varieties of poetry such as ghazals, muhammas, musaddas, or qasidas. When we examine the prosodic rhythm pattern of kafiyan, that the Punjabi poetry by a famous Punjabi Sufi of Bulleh Shah of 17th to 19th century, we discover some interesting features. This is his kafi. Ikko alif tere dargar. What you need is alif only. Ilmon bas kare o yar. Enough of learning, friend. Jab main sabak ishq da pariya, dariya dekh wahdatta bariya. When I learned the lesson of love, I found the river of tawheed to dive in. This is a typical type of kafiyan. And number one is traditional, according to the matra, that the Indic prosody, that it has 15 matras, and the second one has 16 matras. Ikko, al, if, te, de, darga, like that. But very interestingly, that this kafiyan can be scanned according to the rules of Persian foot, as one is special, that the falun, 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 falun. And the second one is Farun, 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 like that. That most of the Bulleh Shah's poetry is based on the same prosodic pattern. That is to say, it's Farun, 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 and or Farun, 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 Fa. These meters simply consist of repetitions of Farun, which at the same time can be scanned as a vernacular rhythm. Bulleh Shah was a very radical person. Okay. So, because of the intoxication. We see another example, one of the famous Qawwali songs of Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan. That this is Ye Zameen Jab Na Thi, Ye Jahan Jab Na Tha. When there was neither land nor world, it was you, it was you. Chand Suraj Na The, Asman Jab Na Tha. When there was neither sun nor stars nor sky, it was you, like that. But this is one couplets of one Qawwali song, and this is of same prosodic rhythm. So Urdu poetry of Sabuk Hindi developed both by adapting Persian prosody and by creating new prosodic patterns. Perhaps the most interesting phenomenon is that when an Urdu poem is scanned by a word can be syllabified, and the boundary of a foot of Persian prosody does not always coincide with the word break. That is to say, Urdu poets write poems solely based on the prosodic rhythms, without caring about the boundaries of words and sentence. You see that Ye Za Min Jab Na Ti Chand Suraj, these are independent words, but the Chand Dusu Lajna Te, like that, one word is cut, scanned into, divided according to the matras. And this is another famous song of Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, which includes the couplets of several different prosodic rhythms. Faila, tung, failun, faila, tung, failun, faila, tung, failun. Green one, maful, faila, tung, maful, mafailun, maful, faila, tung. And the second, another couplet, mafailun, faila, tung, mafailun, failun, like that. And the last, that the Haq Ali Ali, Haq no Mola Ali Ali. These our Qawwali may contain phrases of different prosodic patterns. The above example includes 3 distinct prosodic patterns and 1 chant. The last phrase of the chant Haq Ali Ali, Mola Ali Ali is not based on any Persian meter, but is simply an interjected Arabic language chant. The purpose of Qawwali singers is not to create songs on a strict prosodic basis, like others, but simply to excite the audience. They often combine different phrases in a single song according to the situation. The kind of mixture of improvisation seems to be related to the flexibility and the acceptance of different prosodic patterns in Urdu prosody. Poetry in South Asia, conclusion, is characterized by a dual trend in its prosody, that is to say, vernacular prosody based on vernacular matras as well as Persian prosody. The former was influenced by Bhakti movement or other local ritual or religious practices, whereas the latter originated in Persian poetry and was introduced into South Asia along with other aspects of Islamic civilization. Soon after, Islamic culture was introduced into South Asia along with other aspects of Islamic culture. As a result of this syncretism with elements of vernacular culture, its poetry took on dual trends. One being philosophical Sufism taught at the court or among the nobles, with poems strictly adhering to Persian prosodic patterns. The other being Sufism as a kind of popular culture recited at the Sufi tones, with a prosody based on matras, but at the same time their matras can be scanned according to the rules of Persian prosody as well. The audiences of these Kafians seems to be indifferent as to whether a poem is composed in Persian or vernacular meter. Such trends had their own domains and prosodies, but influenced each other. The more so as some Persian rhythms were similar to those of the vernacular languages. In South Asia, poets began to incorporate vernacular words into Persian poetry, adapting them to the rules of Persian prosody. It was a natural step for poets to apply foreign prosody to vernacular poetry, as both prosody are similar in many of their patterns. Last, this resemblance of Persian and vernacular prosodies and the deliberate carelessness in using different meters in the same poem helped to bring out a mixture of a syncretism in Qawwali songs. We cannot definitely determine who first did so and when, but at least we can say that neither poets nor audiences in South Asia felt any incompatibility in this combination of Persian and native prosodies. And this feeling can be one of the basic reasons why Sufi music was widely accepted by the people of India. Thank you very much.
Control my time. Sorry, 20 minutes. Retaliate. No, this is the wrong PowerPoint, so can we get the correct one? I think I should put it here. This is from a conference last week, sorry. This, maybe I put it on? It said Kyoto Idol on it. Is it there? Maybe I didn't save it correctly. That might be possible, but while you're doing that, I should have checked that earlier. I want to thank the organizers for their vision. I can also present without. I was in Hanover last week, so this is a wrong PowerPoint given. Maybe there is a mistake, so I think maybe I saved it wrong. So that might be. If I saved it wrong, it's okay. I can just. Thank you. Maybe, can we do the last saved one?
Kyoto Idol is halfway down.
Yeah, maybe then I did something wrong.
This
okay.
one?
That's okay, then maybe, I do without PowerPoint. Maybe I wrote it wrong. I may have saved it wrong. That's okay. But it seems that inside I saved the wrong file. So I will be okay. I can present here without PowerPoint. That's okay. Huh? It's on my computer, but we are good. We're all good, yeah. So, no worries, seriously. Yeah.
We can connect directly your computer.
My daughter is using the computer, so they have to watch it. So let me then do it without that. But I want to also carefully look at the time in the next 15 minutes so that we have enough time to talk. So I want to thank for this visionary initiative. And I think one important vision that is coming out of this program and cooperation between America, Turkey, and Japan is that Islamic studies and most of the humanities and social sciences have been highly Eurocentric. That many people theorize about humanity based on the experience of a small group of Europeans. And this is the nature of universities and academia, that the globalization of academia started in Europe and America and spread to the rest of the world. And unfortunately, we still carry the legacy of that Western white perspective in social sciences and humanities. Thus, as a result, there can be more light, this is a very good advantage. As a result, Islamic studies also had to deal with very European perspectives. And I want to today talk about briefly what good can come out of doing collaboration between Japan and America and what we can learn from the methodology of Islamic studies with an attention to the question of Islamophobia and the experience of Islamic studies fighting against Islamophobia. So what I want to do is to talk about one interesting phenomenon with regard to Islamophobia is that Japanese scholars have also thought about this question, both in 1930s and 40s, and they have been thinking about this question today. In 1930s and 40s, many of the Japanese scholars of Islam talked about overcoming European white prejudices in Islamic studies. In fact, in 1930s and 40s, in Japan, people like Okubo Koji and others, whose picture you can see with Ataturk, he said that Islam is not a religion of sword, kılıç, which is also an important term in Japanese, adopted from Europe, that Islam spread by the force of sword, kılıç, and I think it goes back to the British Orientalist. So Japanese were also using the word Koran ka kenka, either Quran or the sword. And in 1930s, Islamic studies scholars in Japan said that no, Islam is a religion of love. They emphasized that other aspect of Islam and tried to study Islam based on some sort of a non-European perspective, and without the fear of Europeans, who were the empires at that time to rule over Muslims, that the Muslims were against Christianity. But today I want to kind of talk about one important aspect of this question with reference to the puzzle that I'm dealing with. The puzzle is that it was better to study Islam in 1970s than 1980s. And even though we have more scholars of Islam and Islamic studies in America, Islamophobia also became stronger. And I want to clarify this puzzle with reference to an important event that in April 1976, Queen Elizabeth opened an exhibition on Islamic science in London. This exhibition was part of a year-long festival of museum concerts and lectures on Islamic art, culture, religion, history, as part of a spectacular program called the World of Islam Festival of 1976. In fact, the Aramco magazine in 1976 noted that as far as anyone can remember, such an attempt has never been made before and probably could not have been in another context. In fact, there were 6,000 objects from 250 public and private collections in more than 30 different Muslim countries were brought to London, 162 lectures, 50 days of academic seminars involved, and in addition to Queen Elizabeth opening the World of Islam Festival, we have Queen of Persia came, and Sheikh al-Azhar was also present. And the reason why I'm mentioning this World of Islam Festival of 1976, some of you would remember, maybe might have participated in that festival, because many leading scholars of Sufism played a key role in this festival. Organizer was Paul Killer, later as a Muslim known as Ahmed Paul Killer, Sayyid Hussein Nas, Titus Buchard, Martin Links, and other scholars of Sufism were behind the idea of this World of Islam Festival. They produced amazing sets of books, BBC documentaries. So this was spectacular, and there is actually a lot of British Muslim nostalgia about it. I watched the 14th anniversary recollections at School of Oriental and African Studies, which is on YouTube. You should look at it. And the organizers are young British Muslims who are saying that this happened 40 years ago. We had less bias and prejudice, more interest in Islam and art and culture, and we now deal more of racism today as British Muslims. So they asked this question, is that, well, how do we explain this phenomenon that in 40 years we have more studies of Islam, more books, more documentaries, and more knowledge, but more fanaticism or more hatred of Islam? And this, of course, has something to do with the fact that 1980s is a very dramatic time in the Middle East and Muslim societies that has started with the Iranian Revolution or the failure of the Camp David Accords, Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Then the whole dark 1980s created what we call the strong media Orientalism. And that actually this kind of stark destinies of Edward Said and Bernard Lewis will illustrate that. That Edward Said wrote his Orientalism in 1978, just 2 years after this World of Islam festival, and his critique was a critique that was showing the prejudices and biases in the study of Islam in America and Europe, and he actually became the accepted perspective and methodology in American academia. At that time, Bernard Lewis has just moved to Princeton, and even in the 50s, I actually studied, kind of found references to Bernard Lewis. Even in the 50s, he had very racist remarks about Muslims, saying that they are as fanatic as the communists, they hate the West. And scholars in the 1964 Conference on Islam and International Affairs start the conference by making fun of him, saying that we have these scholars who think that Islam matters and is as fanatic as communists. He's completely wrong. And so we know that Bernard Lewis is kind of discredited, that he has never gone to Mesa after 1982. But Bernard Lewis has the best time in his career in the 1980s. He was all over the media, even in 1990s, and his book was a bestseller after September 11. And I think this fork, this divergence, or this puzzle can be explained with the fact that no matter how much we talk about the great humanistic values of Islam by reference to Sufism or other aspects of Islamic intellectual traditions, we should not forget two things: that being Muslim from 1870s onwards was highly racialized. That being Muslim is not about how much you pray or how much you fast, but being Muslim is like being from the yellow race. So that in a way, the Japanese perspective could be very useful. And I'm not saying because I'm a big fan of George Takei, who happens to be the champion defending Muslim rights in post-Trump America, as a Japanese American, also making parallels between racialization of Japanese in America and the racialization of Muslims in America. And I think what is forgotten here is that for the black race and for the yellow race, we know that the skin color is the reason for categorizing them as less than human, that not equal to white people. For Muslims, perhaps similar to Hindus and Jews, these racializations happen with reference to their religion. So being Muslim is always was something like being black and being yellow. And secondly, racialization of Muslims also had a lot to do with international politics and geopolitics. That it wasn't just that Europeans had prejudices and biases from medieval times. It has something to do with the fact that British Empire was the biggest empire that ruled over almost half of world's Muslims. And those Muslims wanted either independence or equality within the empire. And the rejection of these claims of equality also created the condition that Muslims are not equal to white, and they are inferior because of their religion. And as part of it, for the Turks, this is a very familiar story, but the Ottoman Empire also mattered in the racialization of Muslims. And the whole story about the Christians and the Greeks being liberated from the Ottomans as Gladstone said, anti-human specimen of humanity, according to Gladstone. And that term, calling Ottoman Muslims as anti-human by British Prime Minister, is an illustrative of the racism against Muslims at that time. And what I want to kind of make the case that we see another turning point in the 1980s as what we call the re-racializations of Muslims, that after the colonial period, perhaps there is some sort of a new ways of thinking about Muslims in the world of nation states, but the re-racializations comes back with vengeance. in a way, that's why the 1980s and 1990s is a time we have stronger forms of Islamophobia. And in that context, I think we need a comparison with Japan that can be very useful. What I mean by this is that most of the Muslim intellectuals and scholars of Islam in America, in Europe, have this common strategy when they see racism, is that when they see Muslims are seen inferior, they naturally emphasize that, look, Muslims also have Sufism, they have philosophy, they have science, they have a civilization, therefore they're equal, that you need to treat them as human, they are not as bad as you think they are. And that's the kind of major response of Muslim modernism. That's also the major response of a lot of scholarship on Islam, that we have art, we have science, we have architecture, which is great. I think I have been doing this in my classes all the time. That's one way of responding to Islamophobia and racism. But that's never enough. I think we need to learn how to confront the racism by calling it as racism. That Islamophobia, the Orientalism is a foundation of racism against Muslims. And I think many Japanese scholars of Islam kind of understood that, and their perspective on Muslim societies are different. Maybe that also reflected in the fact that, as far as I could see, there is more study of Sufism in Japan than on radical Islam. I hope I am right. And they, because their also experiences that when African Americans or Chinese or the Japanese were exposed to racism, they didn't have to prove that Buddhism or Christianity has moral values, and that's why the black-skinned or yellow-skinned people are equal to white-skinned people. That I think the strategies were very different. That's why through this cooperation between Japan, America, and Turkey, we may actually think about how Islamic studies scholars could fight more effectively against Islamophobia, and how they can learn from each other. And I hope that we could do this together in the future. Thank you. So by having this way, we have now, now I'm going back to be the chair, we have 20 minutes. And for questions and answers, so I will take my seat there. And please, the floor is yours. I will wait. I'm sure somebody will have questions. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much for all. My question is to my close friend, Mr. Jimmy. Dr. Jimmy, do you think that in new international politics, some superpowers also are planning to use Sufism in confronting radical Islamic movements? Do you think so?
There are experts in this room who are very knowledgeable on this. I am looking at them, Juliana, Amit, Carl, and others. And I think their presentations mentioned this. Yes, I think there is a danger in Sufism studies that there are superpowers who are trying to use, as Amit and other scholars mentioned, Rumi, Mevlana, and Sufism, and as a basis of a moderate Islam as an alternative to radical Islam. And that, I think, is something to be aware of. As scholars, we should not only do very good scholarship, we should also be aware of how our scholarship can be manipulated by people. But that manipulation can be true for everybody. It's not unique to the study of Sufism. There's also a lot of scholars of Islamic law who are trying to prove that if understood correctly, Islamic law can be compatible with this and that empire or this group. So there could be so many different ways of doing this. I mean, I think the scene is much more complex as you lived in Iran, that you're very familiar with the politics of international affairs after Iranian Revolution and Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. So this question of racism and geopolitics are very interlinked, in addition to the study of Islam and Islamic studies. But you may have other comments from here. I think both of you also work on the same topic. So I see Carl and Amit. Yes, Carl?
Question for Dr. Yamane. I loved your presentation. It was extremely moving, and it's always great to see.
I was moving.
We were all moving, yes. I wonder if you might be interested to use a different word than syncretism. And in particular, you were talking about linguistic phenomena and diglossia or other. There are many societies where people speak more than one language.
Yes.
And I have some copies of early manuscripts of Chishti sheikhs who grew up like Baba Farid, speaking a form of old Punjabi.
Yeah.
It's their mother tongue.
Yes.
It's not a foreign language.
Mm.
And so the problem, I think, with syncretism is that it postulates that you have two different cultures that are incompatible.
Mm. Yeah, yes.
And so then, surprise, they are mixing. I don't think that helps you very much. But if you could talk about, you are clearly, you love the way the language works. And so if you pursued a metaphor that uses language, I think that would advance your project a little bit better. And I'll send you a little piece about syncretism if you're interested. But thank you for a really delightful presentation.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much for your suggestion. Yes, really, the syncretism is the thing which is a kind of creation, new creation of among some different creatures. But as far as the language is concerned, that the language is always changes and yes, and it includes many other vocabularies. So for the languages that it is made, I think that it is not appropriate to use that word of syncretism. Yeah, thank you very much.
Omi?
So this is just to continue the conversation with the question that Mahmoud raised. Thank you. We're among people here who all share an appreciation and engagement and analysis of Sufism. So in the language of the cool kids, we're on hashtag Team Sufi here. But I would say that I think one of the injustices that we can do is to collapse the beautiful and extraordinary spectrum of Islamic thought and practice into big, bad, scary Wahhabis on one side and good, beautiful, luminous, apolitical Sufis on the other side. And sometimes that is done not only by scholars of Sufism, but even by self-avowing Sufis themselves. So as Juliana pointed out yesterday, Sheikh Hasham Kebani, the Naqshbandi Naqshbandi representative of Sheikh Nazim in America, he is the person responsible for the outrageous myth that 80% of American mosques are infiltrated by Wahhabis, a claim that is perpetuated by every neoconservative website since then. And of course, he's positing himself as the antidote. You have someone like Stephen Schwartz, right, who has a particular attachment to a Bosnian form of Islam, who then goes to work for Daniel Pipes, right? So there can be a Sufi who actually finds common alliance with someone as despicable as Daniel Pipes in that sense. And I think that Jamil, the perfect example of this conversation is someone like Imam Faisal Abdul-Rauf, a very lovely, moderate Muslim who is celebrated, and the title of his book gives everything away. What's right with Islam is what's right with America, but it's a view, forget everything he says about Islam, but it's a view of America that has nothing to say about slavery, racism, empire, the extermination of indigenous people, and so on. So I think just as we're all called upon to do better and more informed and rigorous analysis of Sufism, I also hope that for those of us who work on particular cultural and national contexts, that we display an equal amount of scrutiny and analysis in the scenes, in the geographical locales that we're doing our research in. Thank you.
Thank you. Juliana? The mic can go there, just. Juliana, yeah. It's,
Thank you, all three, for those wonderful presentations. I want to talk to Miriam because I'm excited. Thank you so much, both for forefronting gender in a way that I didn't manage to do. I would have liked to. And for connecting us to three very different women. I'm sure for a course there would probably be more that we could engage in. And I have a real religious studies question, a very American religious studies question, which is something that's sort of been floating in other presentations as well. That has to do both with the fact that all the presentations here were in English, and we have somehow naturalized the idea that English is a sort of a neutral medium for this conversation. And I want to pin it on the word saint, because there is, in Sufi studies, at least in the US context, a discussion about what it means to use the word saint, both in the context of Sufism, but also in other contexts, Muslim contexts. And so I wonder if you have any thoughts about that, because the claim you made at the end about Zainab al-Ghazali especially strikes me as investment in what a saint is that is very specific, and so you must have some thoughts about what that means to you.
yeah.
Thanks very much for that question and provocation, and I probably won't be able to answer it properly because I'm not a religious studies scholar. But I guess I've worked this paper backwards. So it was a long time ago that I started to be interested in Zainab al-Ghazali. And I was interested in the text, Ayyam al-Hayati, as kind of feminist manual almost. This is the way you can be empowered. She had a lot of murids around her, boys and girls, men and women. And so as I put together this text, this prison memoir, with the person that I met, and didn't really get to know her particularly well, certainly didn't have anything other than a very controlled interview with her, where I would ask a question, and then she would turn on the recorder, and then when she
had finished recording her answer, she would turn it off again. So she was producing a text. I called it a hagiography because I saw so many similarities with other saints' lives, which is why I guess I was really struck this morning with this young girl who wanted to become a martyr. And it was then peeling back through Lala Aisha Manoubiya. So I spent quite some time at her Manouba shrine in Tunisia that I then ended up with Rabia. So I moved back, and then as I was beginning to see that there was a model or a frame narrative that emerged, I guess, out of Attar in particular, I then became interested in the way in which the story goes back from Lala Aisha, for example, and then from Zainab al-Ghazali back to Lala Aisha, and then back to Rabia. So I was very interested in the stories that went both ways. And so I don't know if I have a definition for a saint that would go beyond the sort of the critical elements in a hagiography that don't necessarily bear much relationship to a real life story, but that it is, or to a real life, but it is a story that creates the saint. So that's, I guess, was that any good? Yeah. Okay.
Mr. Chairman, can I ask a first question?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Well, actually, my question is...
sorry,
Bruce.
Somebody else?
Bruce.
Oh, I couldn't see Bruce. Bruce is behind the camera.
I'm sorry.
Let's give Bruce the voice on that.
I'm not to defer to you.
Please.
No, I wanted to say, first of all, thank you for this fascinating panel. I would love to have heard the fourth person as well, but the three of you certainly, even with some technical difficulties, overcame them to perform. And I want to emphasize to Yamane so how much I enjoyed the performance that he did and the elaboration about Qawwali. I want to say one thing that's just very brief correction, that when you were talking about Amir Khusro, the really where he gave all the songs was not Yayınevi but Nizamuddin. It was the tomb of Nizamuddin Chishti, whom we heard about earlier today, who was really in the Pir-Murid relationship with Nizamuddin.
Yes.
But I want to go to a much deeper question for you about, and this goes to Jamil's point about the nostalgia. I don't think I'm nostalgic, but I do have fond memories of the 70s, including traveling around all of North India with a woman named Anne-Marie Schimmel as her mahram. This is now an open secret. It used to just be between my wife and me that there was another woman in my life named Schimmel. So now everybody knows it. But we had to go around to all these Sufi shrines because she wanted to hear the performances. She said, oh, you know, of course, there are these great superstars. Even back in the 70s, Nusrat was sort of known as a superstar, and the Sabri brothers, who I'm sure you also know about. But she wanted to go and hear all of these local shrines and hear how the Sufis perform, and especially Sayyid Ashraf Jahangir Samnani in Kachauta Sharif, which you may not know about, but it's a really, don't ever go there. It's a really tough place, even in the 70s, but now it's even more tough. But still, the songs there were fantastic. And I can still remember those songs and remember the experience of how that both Professor Schimmel and I had there. But the thing that I want to ask you now is, beyond my delight, like Carl's and like I think every happy heart in this room, delighted with your performance, not only is Nostra dead, in the sense that he's no longer performing live in this world, although the angels must be trying hard to keep up with him. Nonetheless, when you start to think about what is happening in, especially the United States, Pakistan, and the Sufi shrines and the Urdu celebrations where, until very recently, it was possible to have exuberance at the Urdu of great saints, and now there's more fear than there's exuberance. And I wonder how you comment upon this, even though, as Jamil said, there is more emphasis on Sufi studies and Muslim extremists. They nonetheless come together some of these shrines in an unfortunate way when the extremists attack the Sufis at the point of wars. So I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, thank you very much about the current situation. That in 2000, 8 or 9 that the tomb of Baba. No, Lahore. Ganj Bakhsh. The tomb of Ganj Bakhsh in Lahore. There was some summer meeting there, gathering, and at the time that the bomb was put, and more than 85 persons were killed at the time. Since then, all the Muslim shrines are prohibited with any cameras or some bags, so strictly prohibited to enter. So it's quite difficult for us to enter the shrine, but Dargah. But yes, we can enter there. But unfortunately, that such kind of Qawwali parties, mehfil, is has become very. I mean that the number of mehfils maybe decreased since then. Yes.
The last word goes to Professor.
Yeah, thank you very much. By the way, another Sufi group is Qawwali group, Sabi brothers, Sabi brothers. They were martyred, were killed by those Taliban. Recently, we have to commemorate them also. Actually, I would like to know, it is working. I don't know, sometimes it's working and sometimes it's not. I don't know what is going on. Thank you. I would like to learn, I would like to know from maybe Dr. Cemil's comment on the issue, or more Ümit's comment on the case of Hisham Kabbani's situation. My question is this: if some powers wants to use Sufis against radicals, why they publicize this secret meeting? You know, this meeting with some governmental bodies, they met with Hisham Kabbani privately, secretly. Then it was, you know, inside the room there was nobody else. Them and Hisham Kabbani. As you know, Kabbani promised them something and made a voluntary agent for them. Then who publicized this meeting? Then we learn from the media. And why they publicize it?
I can tell you.
Yes, please.
Who can tell us? Carl, yes.
We have to go back to a meeting. There was a public meeting sponsored by an organization called the Nixon Center. And there was a woman named Zena, you remember the name? Begins with a B, last name. Anyway, she has a paper for the Rand Corporation, which is available on the internet. And at this meeting, they invited a number of scholars, the most prominent of whom was Bernard Lewis. And there used to be some photographs of Bernard Lewis and Hisham Kabbani smiling together at this event. And some other people whose names I won't mention were there as well. But it was a public event, but it's become a little bit quieter. So this was a conference in which they were discussing this notion of the utility of Sufism as a support of American foreign policy. So there are several other initiatives of this kind. And the American Embassy has also spent money on the restoring some of the Sufi shrines in India. And full disclosure, I supervised a conference in India on Sufism that received a large contribution from the American Embassy as well. But we thought it was fairly innocuous. But you have to treat this very carefully because, as they used to say, when you go to the court, you should bring your shroud, just in case.
Well, we thank you all. This is the end of this session. Now that Donald Trump decided to work with King Salman, I think this topic can be out of fashion probably. The Wahhabis will be the new agents of empire. But we thank you all, and we would like to meet at 5:15 exactly back here for the last concluding panel. Thank you.